Ladies and gentlemen, happy Tuesday. Crazy that today is Tuesday. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend, relaxing 3-day weekend. I know for us at the Cooper household, we were able to enjoy it outside. We went to Noblesville up to one of their parks and was able to kind of enjoy the day on Saturday. And then yesterday we went to Broad Ripple and kind of enjoyed the time in Broad Ripple, fed some of the ducks, the geese, and just kind of enjoyed the time there. So, hey, if you would, I see some of us not having the video feed on there. I just need to double check, make sure that we are there so that way I can get attendance and everyone is properly there. So that way I can get that. Today, as you could kind of see in our group chat, you can kind of see that we've got a warm up, and then we will be looking at the end of the Civil War, giving you a preview of this week. We're going to be wrapping up the Civil War today. We'll be getting into the Reconstruction next class, in the next couple classes, and that will wrap up Civil War and Reconstruction Unit 2. So we have all that taken care of. So today, here is our warm-up. If you would, go ahead and in your response or in your chat function, go ahead and respond to today's warm-up while I get attendance. If you put in the chat function that the vice president is the one who takes over, you are absolutely correct. And in this case, we will see who that vice president is as we look at our notes for today and as our activity today as we end the Civil War. And again, yes, we have a little bit of notes. Today's Tuesday, so I like to focus in on some direct instruction. And then tomorrow we'll do a little reconstruction activity for you all. All right, so again, those of you just joining in, here was today's warm-up, just in the chat function. Take a moment. What happens if they are no longer capable of leading? The other quick question is, any of you guys know out there of another president who was no longer capable of leading due to an assassination? What other presidents have been assassinated? Yeah, Charlie Stevenson, hot off the press, very good. Yeah, Kennedy. And there's some weird and crazy coincidences between Kennedy, his assassination, and this gentleman, Abraham Lincoln's assassination. And that will kind of scoop you out a little bit in looking at their assassinations and how sometimes they kind of intercede and kind of tie in together. All right. I just want to also recap for you from last class, or I guess last week. If you recall, on Friday, I had a quick little video. I was out, and then you just did a WSQ, and then you also submitted your trading cards. The trading cards, again, those where you pick 5 major events from the Civil War, and you kind of look at those as like a baseball card. So today, if you're following along, and if you're looking at our homepage, we're going to be looking at the end of the Civil War. So today is the 8th. And I have a clip later on that I will share with you about the ending of the Civil War. So the end of the Civil War, we're going to go ahead and resume recording. We're going to look at a couple stages of the end of the Civil War and how this war kind of comes to a conclusion and what happens to our nation. If you recall, President Lincoln, his main focus was to try and keep the nation together as a whole. So at the end of the Civil War, the first major events we have is called Sherman's March to the Sea. So these are our notes for today. And if you recall, Tuesdays, I like to kind of focus in on taking some direct instruction. And so with Sherman's March to the Sea, in 1864, General Grant would become commander of the Union armies, and he would appoint William Tecumseh Sherman as the commander of the military division within Mississippi. And so he would then use his tactics of total war to then take out the South and starts to function and go into the South. And he would start using the civilian population as well as the armies to then go in and create havoc within the South. William Tecumseh Sherman was a young general, and he was the one who would actually go in and start burning all the things in the South. In fact, he would take the rail lines and the railroad tiles of the South, and he would wrap them around trees. And he would melt them and wrap them around trees, so that way they would look like bow ties, almost kind of like a bow tie. And they would actually call these the Sherman neckties. The reason for that is so that the South could no longer use those rail lines in the future. And so it was a way of destroying the South itself. So we start off today looking at Sherman's March to the Sea. In 1864, he becomes the commander, and he leads his military division within Mississippi. That's what MS, Mississippi. Sherman's march, he would then close in onto Atlanta. And this was the transportation hub center of the South. And as they were coming in, the Confederates would actually be mounted high up onto the hills and start watching as Sherman's army was coming in and burning things in sight. And they could see it from a defensive standpoint way out in the area of Georgia. He would then go upon the offensive, burning Atlanta and everything else in its path. He would then capture Savannah, Georgia, and move on to South Carolina, where he would inflict even more damage within Georgia. And here in the next clip here, I have a little video to show you about Sherman's march to the sea and his conquest throughout the South. Let me make sure this is working. Yep.
Lincoln puts the North's entire industrial might behind one final push. The man who will lead the charge from Chattanooga to Atlanta, William Sherman. His orders, to stop for nothing.
I would make this war as severe as possible and show no symptoms of tiring till the South begs for mercy.
Advancing under the cover of night, Sherman's march is sustained by one of the greatest logistical operations yet seen in this conflict. Sherman knows he needs to throw everything he's got at the Confederate Army. While he uses his own supply lines to maximum effect, he destroys those of the South, ripping up their railroad and bending it beyond use. In one day, the North's supply lines replaced 200,000 bullets. South is left scavenging on the battlefield for spent rounds, food, even old boots. Sherman calls it total war, a scorched earth approach that becomes the trademark of modern warfare. Finally, with Atlanta under siege, Confederate forces set fire to their own munitions stores before abandoning their city to the Union soldiers. Sherman's tactics of total war have won out. His victory helped secure Lincoln's election in the fall. With Atlanta in ruins, he just keeps going, now launching what will be his final assault, the March to the Sea. In the 19th century equivalent of shock and awe, 62,000 Union soldiers wreak a 60-mile wide path of destruction across Georgia. From Atlanta to the coast at Savannah. Supply lines are cut, villages are sacked, and crops torched. Anything of military value is destroyed.
All right, so in that little clip, you can identify, okay, this is the March to the Sea. It is a total offensive, meaning that it is going to take out everything in its path. And so as he's making this trek, he is taking these, like I mentioned, these rail lines, and he's going through and using the rail lines as a means of destroying the South's way of communication, being able to then take it out and, let's see, make it there we go. So as he's making his way to the sea, Sherman would use what is called the scorched earth policy. And what he does is basically burns everything in sight. He takes the rail lines and he starts to destroy the rail lines so that way the South cannot rebuild. And these rail lines that were all throughout the South were called, like I mentioned, the Sherman's neckties. And this, again, was a means of trying to end the war quickly and end the war in a rapid pace so that way the North and the South could then rejoin during the Reconstruction. Meanwhile, up in the North, you start to see the movements in trying to encompass or try to circle around the South, and that was through the Gettysburg and also through some of those other battles, like at the Battle of Antietam, which you guys read about or saw in Friday's class. Now here's another image of kind of Sherman's march to the sea. This here is Sherman as he's on his horse looking throughout the area. And a lot of times what happens is the slaves would then join his crusade throughout the South because they, again, wanted to be freed. And so he would then allow them to join in, and they would then be fighting with the Union officers and trying to stop the Confederates all throughout the South itself. And this, you can see in the background, the burning and the total war itself. Now the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. This is of Grant going in and approaching the South. And what happens is they approach from the west while Sherman comes in from the south. And as they're approaching it, they then circle around the Confederates. And this is an important date to remember. On April the 9th, 1865, they surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. kind of a side note, the gentleman who actually owned this private village or this private home, he wanted to get away from the fighting and he wanted to get away from the problems of the war. In fact, he said, I want to be peaceful. And so he leaves and he finds this house in Virginia. And long story short, the Confederates and the Union soldiers would actually meet at his house, and that's where they would sign the papers for the surrendering. And in fact, a lot of the soldiers would take memorabilia or possessions from the house. Things such as even small things like wallpaper or silverware from the actual house. So that way they had a piece of history of Appomattox Courthouse and the surrender of the Civil War. Now, the importance of the surrender. There are two major things about the surrender that are key and should be noted for this. And that is the Confederate soldiers. They would not be prosecuted for treason. So at this end of the war, we have the terms of agreement. Now that's important because, again, the whole goal for Lincoln was to have a unified nation. So he did not want there to be this feeling of, okay, the South is now over with, and we're going to have a lot of tension arise between the North and the South still, even after the war is over with. So he and Grant came up with the compromises, and they said that they would not prosecute the South for treason, meaning that they would not be looked upon as breaking away and being that of going against their country. A second agreement is that the cavalry and the infantry would be able to keep their horses. Now, the significance of that would be the reason for plowing and being able to grow crops. The South was very rich, again, with fields and being able to have a lot of crops. And so they wanted to allow them to keep their horses so that way they could grow crops in the South. So the terms of agreement, they could then keep their horses. And then finally, they would give them 3 days rations of food. That way they could then be able to send the Confederate soldiers back home. So on April the 9th, 1865, we have the terms of agreements to the end of the Civil War. This Sherman's March to the Sea in 1865, if we move a little bit forward, we start to see the issue at hand, and that was, again, trying to get Lincoln. Lincoln was, again, elected in 1864 for a second term, and that's where he would then attract Southerners by nominating Andrew Johnson as his vice president. So a name to be familiar with is that of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was pro-union. He was from Tennessee. And he is now the vice president. So that question earlier today was who kind of takes over if the president can no longer has capabilities of leading, and that would be the vice president. Lincoln would then defeat General McClellan. And if you recall, General McClellan was actually one of the generals of the Union armies. He would actually be fired by Lincoln. And this is also of importance. After the election, Lincoln offers the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment would ban slavery in the United States. In the election of 1864, here we have kind of a map of the states going for Lincoln. You can see the red. Those are the electoral votes for President Lincoln. and then you can see in the green for McClellan. Now, again, the Confederate states, so those in kind of the tan color, they, again, were not part of this election. Again, another strategy of Lincoln was to call back several of his troops, and so that way they could vote, and they would vote for pro-Lincoln in this instance. So in the election of 1864, Lincoln would beat and defeat General McClellan with approximately 233 of those votes. Now, 1865, about 5 days after the surrender, we have President Lincoln assassination. And this was at Ford's Theater. He and his wife go to a play at the Ford's Theater. And while at the play, John Wilkes Booth jumps out and fires the fateful bullets that would actually hit Lincoln in the back of the head. John Wilkes Booth would then escape from the Ford's Theater. He would actually, as he's jumping down from the banister, he would yell out, "Sic semper tyrannius," which is thus always with tyrants. And as he is jumping and, leaving the stage, he would actually have his leg injured, and he would break his leg. And so he would later be captured a couple miles outside of Washington, D.C., where he was in a barn healing his leg. His leg was all wrapped up. And so Lincoln is shot. He is then escorted across the street to a local physician, where he would then be announced dead by assassin bullet. And John Wilkes Booth was a Southerner who was pro-slavery. He was also an actor. And a couple side notes with that is he actually timed it up while at the play to where the crowd was loud and kind of clapping or laughing at the same time as his bullets and his gun went off, so that it was not as loud and people did not necessarily hear it. And when he jumped from the banister, a lot of people thought it was part of the play. And so he himself jumps from the banister. He gets his foot caught in kind of one of the decorations and kind of lands awkwardly, where his leg is then twisted or kind of sprained / broken. And so John Wilkes Booth would then be the assassin for Lincoln. There was also a plot to actually kidnap President Lincoln. And this is a poster there you see in the middle of the reward for other people who were a part of the assassination attempt. They were going to kidnap Lincoln, hold him for ransom, so that North would then have to surrender to the South. They were also going to then capture and assassinate the Secretary of State, Edwin Stanton, and then also try and capture the Vice President as well, Andrew Johnson. However, those plans did not work out. Later on, those people who were part of the conspiracy would eventually be captured, and they would be tried and they would be hanged to death for their ideas of trying to kill President Lincoln and also kill the others on the group. Now, Lincoln's assassination, the very next morning, two issues arise as we look at the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, stepping in. So on the morning of April the 15th, 1865, President Lincoln would be the first president to be assassinated. The two big problems for the country was, how do we restore our southern states? And how do we integrate 4 million newly freed African Americans into national life? Two big things that would be arise with the issue of Lincoln's assassination. Now, like I mentioned, there are a lot of conspiracies between, I guess not conspiracies, but kind of weird coincidences between Lincoln's assassination and Kennedy's assassination. One of that being that Lincoln was in a theater and he was there watching a play in Washington, D.C., obviously, and he gets shot in the back of the head. Kennedy himself was in an open caravan or an open, I guess, convertible, and it happened to be a Lincoln Mercury convertible, and he was shot in the back of the head. Other coincidences or kind of weird similarities is that when John Wilkes Booth flees, he is actually captured in a warehouse where he is eventually shot, and no trial would actually take place for him. He actually dies before he's actually convicted of the murder or the assassination. Meanwhile, Lee Harvey Oswald, the gentleman who shot President Kennedy, he was actually in a warehouse where he was set up for an assassination onto Kennedy, and he flees and he's captured at a theater. So it's almost like the things were reversed, and Lee Harvey Oswald would actually be shot and killed before he goes on trial. And so there was kind of the conspiracy that he was a cover-up for another group that was out there that was trying to assassinate Kennedy and so forth. So it's kind of weird things out there that they have some similarities to them. So Lincoln's assassination, first president, and then now we have the costs of the war. We have over 600,000 Americans dead. That would be more than all the American wars combined. And there would be one soldier killed for every 4 slaves that became free. And this would cost over $3 billion. $3 billion. And the U.S. would have to pay that back over 20 years after the war. Now, again, a lot of that was borrowed money through loans, either from outside nations. A lot of that was also the destruction of buildings that they would have to rebuild in the South. And in the next couple classes, we'll look at the Reconstruction and how the Reconstruction paved the way for mending the United States. All right, so those are the costs of the war. So that is kind of the conclusion of the end of the war. In the next couple classes, we'll look at the Reconstruction of the war. If you recall, we did trading cards last week. This week, we don't have a trading card assignment, but again, we did on Friday a little WSQ. So if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and take some time to do that. All right, that is everything for today. I will see you all